Aizen Sosuke, one of anime and manga's most beloved antagonists. That's no exception for myself, currently ranking as my fourth favourite antagonist of all time. However, over time I've noticed that the reasons why the majority of people seem to like Aizen differ from mine, and I'd like to talk about it. Even after 10 years from when the Thousand Year Blood War ended in the manga, there are still people under Aizen's spell, when there's so much more to him than the fact that he manipulates people. Most specifically, how much of a loser this guy is. Aizen is a fraud and a hypocrite, and that's what makes him so unbelievably fantastic. When I call him a fraud, it's not slander, rather a compliment. And today we'll be dissecting this part of him. How a majority of conversations he has is a reflection of his own vanity. His proclamation of superiority is cope, the duality in goals for Ichigo in wishing to crush him and his subconscious desiring a heart. The fraudulence of science with the Hogyoku and quote-unquote raising Ichigo. How that fraudulence culminates and is perfectly reflected in the Thousand Year Blood War, giving rise to a masterclass of a dynamic, and how a lot of it is done through the symbolism of Aizen's design. A majority of Kubo's characterization and storytelling is done through subtext. Likewise, eyes and sight are incredibly important to Bleach, representing many things, but most importantly knowledge. We fear that which we cannot see, Ulquiorra's entire existence being defined around what he can and cannot see, Yuha's almighty eyes. The amount of characters that have eye-associated imagery is astounding, but for Aizen specifically, his eyes play a major part into looking into the inner workings of his mind. During our first introduction to Aizen and the majority of the Soul Society arc, he's wearing glasses. Glasses act as a literal barrier between us and his eyes, used to see the world through a different lens, or from our perspective, to perceive Aizen in the lens he desires. His Zanbakuto's ability, Kyoko Suigetsu, takes inspiration from a Chinese idiom, translating to mirror, flower, water, moon, referring to beauty that you can see but not interact with. Aizen's character is filled with reflective, illusory motifs. Zanbakutos reflect the self of their wielder. Aizen's sense of self is distorted by the illusions he paints of himself, reflected in Aizen not using his Bankai. Aizen wishes to transcend beyond the boundaries of a Soul Reaper and a Hollow. In order to achieve this transcendence, he'll have needed to firstly reach the pinnacle of them. So, if he has a Bankai, why doesn't he use it? Bankai being the most intimate layer of oneself manifested into reality. Aizen either despises what his Bankai represents, or doesn't understand it. A fantastic line to highlight Aizen's lack of self-understanding is one he says to Toshiro. Adoration is the state furthest from understanding. At first, it's painted as Aizen dominating Toshiro in a conversation. Much like his conversations with almost every other member of the cast, he walks over them. However, these conversations also hold insight into Aizen's sense of self. If we turn this truth of adoration that Aizen states onto Aizen himself, it tells us how little he understands himself. Adoration is defined as respect, reverence, strong admiration, and love for a certain place, person, or thing. Aizen is full of himself. He can't stop talking about how great he is, how above it all he is. What greater sign of insecurity is there than a man who doesn't shut up about how amazing he is? Aizen's adoration of himself are proclamations of how little he understands himself. A lot of Aizen's dialogue are projections of himself. If we correlate this to Young and the Shadow Self, if the Shadow Self is unacknowledged, the Shadow Self is often always unintentionally projected onto others. His dynamic with Ichigo perfectly reflects his sense of self. Ichigo's journey is about understanding himself, his heritage, his power, who he is as a person, self-actualization and understanding the world in a natural manner, completely opposed by Aizen, who doesn't attempt to make any understanding of himself, rather striving further and further away of his true self in pursuit of the Hogyoku. Instead of looking into himself the way that Ichigo does with his inner world, Aizen continually attempts to modify himself, to use science to achieve transcendence, constantly using external factors to do the heavy lifting and label it as his own work. This isn't to say Aizen is weak or dumb, far from it, but without these external factors, Aizen would never have reached the power level where he stands now. Aizen's plans for Ichigo are contradictory and have tension against one another. On one hand, he wishes to see Ichigo at the pinnacle of his strength in order to crush him, to prove that his way of living is correct and the natural order of the world, what Ichigo represents, isn't. On the other hand, there's a possibility to form a heart with someone. This desire lies more in his subconscious. A major part of Aizen's character is his loneliness. Talking about Aizen and his loneliness is like beating a dead horse, so I'll try and keep this brief. To understand Aizen's loneliness, we have to talk about Kai and Shiba and one of Bleach's most important thematics, the heart. Kai and Shiba and his speech on the heart ties to practically every single defining moment in Bleach. Whenever people grow close, a heart is born between them. If you are alone in this world, I don't think you could have a heart. This is partly the basis for Aizen's lack of self. He has no heart because he never had anyone to connect him with the rest of the world. Like Ichigo did with Rukia, like Toshiro did with Rangiku, like Zaraki did with Unohana. All of these interactions were defining moments for the characters I just mentioned, and yet Aizen had nobody. If there won't be anyone to fill the hollow void within him, then he'll fill it himself. However, deep down, he still yearned for that connection, yearned for someone to understand him. It's not that Aizen's strength is the crux of his loneliness, rather his ideological views of the world are. His power merely amplifies it. Where nobody bats an eye or even cares to search the answer for themselves regarding the Soul King's true nature, Aizen does. Learning of the original sin and seeking to kill the king, Aizen's respective left and right hands in Gin and Tozen collaborate with Aizen as they see the flaws and faults of the Soul Society like he does and wish to change them. At least that's how it seems. Aizen desires a heart, desires connection deep down, but copes with that loneliness by using artificial means of suppressing it, lying to both himself and others via cutting away parts of himself in order to cement that solitude. Ichigo being a Soul King candidate, once raised to the pinnacle of strength and defeated, Aizen's way of life is proven right. If Aizen is defeated, whoever defeated him might be able to see things from his point of view, which ultimately does happen. Aizen raises Ichigo for his ultimate experiments, though Aizen himself doesn't really have much of a hand in raising Ichigo as he pretends to. He takes advantage of fortunate coincidences and decides to observe. He's fraudulent in how much he claims to be in control of Ichigo's life, when Ichigo's very creation was a spontaneous event. A moment that we see Aizen the most excited. An event that was outside his hands, beyond the grasp of manipulation, the antithesis of the man he pretends to be. I'll give him credit where credit is due in the creation of White, but beyond that, it was out of his hands. Speaking of scientific impact, each of the three other pillars of science hold insight into Aizen's character, in Mayuri, Xylophoro, and Kisuke. Starting with Xyl, each of the Espada are extensions of Aizen's character. Xyl's method of combat is similar to Aizen. They both talk a lot and antagonize their opponents, but more importantly, when faced with the aspect of death, Xyl's existence becomes an endless cycle of rebirth and evolution. Death is not the end for him. He's a quote-unquote perfect life form. One of Bleach's core messages is that imperfection with room to grow will always outshine perfect and stagnant. As Mayuri states, it's empty, stagnant. He is abhorrent of perfection. Xyl's fraction are hinted to be hollows of his own creation that he consumes to prolong his own life and health himself, a purely self-centered method of living. His underlings merely serve to cement the hole within his soul. The technique for his immortality is also called Gabriel. Gabriel being a prominent angel in the Bible, his name commonly translates to strength of God. And yet for all of Xyl's divinity, his sentencing is a painstakingly long process where death is experienced at an excruciatingly slow pace, sentenced to stand still for a millennia, with nothing but his own thoughts to keep him company. The dynamic between Mayuri and Aizen is through the lens of evolving the Soul Society, through their own extreme methods and very questionable morality, but another tie-in between the two is in their defeats. Both of them fall in the same way, a singular attack at the expense of their enemy's powers, more specifically a Quincy attack. Ichigo's Magetsu is representative of his Quincy heritage, the long black hair, the red eyes, the shadowy Reiatsu. Both Mayuri and Aizen behave similarly, their overly egotistical nature. They both have a very personal, specific vendetta against their opponent, which they attempt to antagonize profusely. After their respective defeats, they have a 180 shift from where they were upon defeat. Mayuri's next major action is helping Uryu against Sael. Aizen helps Ichigo in the final battle. Mayuri's philosophy on perfection was also redefined, where he was previously only interested in Orihime because he thought Uryu had nothing to offer. Aizen's views on perfection are changed more subtly, a point I'll get to later on. The final pillar of scientific parallel is with Kisuke Urahara. Other than Ichigo, Kisuke is the man who understands Aizen the most intimately. Their dynamic as a whole can be summarized with false transcendence and true stagnation. They both understand the nature of the sulking and pick opposing sides. Whilst Kisuke may be on his side, they both act as a shadowy mentor for Ichigo. A lot of Kisuke's true self and character are not explored and left ambiguous. His eyes are constantly covered in shadow by his hat, representing his emotional disconnect, showcased by it not being present during incredibly personal moments. Aizen assists in Ichigo's growth quite literally in the shadows. Both Kisuke and Aizen's design reflect themselves. Kisuke's outfits never change, Aizen's are constantly evolving. But a highlight of Aizen's fraudulence is in the use of the Hogyoku. Aizen's original Hogyoku failed. After pouring so many souls into it, it still wasn't satisfied. Taking Kisuke's creation and melding it with his own, Aizen likes to proclaim that he subdued the Hogyoku, that it's inherently beneath him, where without it, he'd never be in the position he is now. Zael showcases his false divinity, Mayuri the growth from wrongdoings, and Kisuke a reflection of two morally grey stances on the roots of the world. Now, let's talk about how Aizen's characterization is reflected in his design. Aizen's character is, in my opinion, best represented by the form we see him in the least. A perfect metaphor for how enigmatic he is. His final transformation during the Deicide arc. This entire design showcases every aspect of Aizen's character. The faces being peeled to the sides are representative of Aizen's desire for connection, the only actual human part of the evolution he still has left. They've been pushed to the side, out of the way, symbolizing the way he lies to himself about not needing others and being above all, and how those lies bury this truth deep into his subconscious. Whilst the monstrous face taking center stage represents his rage, anger, and frustration with the natural order of things. Both the three hollow holes and three eyes represent his forced and unnatural attaining of power, reflecting how his method of transcendence is not how it's meant to be achieved. Alongside this, Aizen's wings are deformed and grotesque, merely appearing to be an outstretch of the symbolism of his unnatural transcendence. Alongside this, his wings have eyes on them. The choice to include his eyes ingrained into his malformed wings is an outstretch of the symbolism of his false transcendence, symbolizing his false knowledge, the fact that he believes this way of life to be true, and his belief in using the Hogyoku to transcend is correct. The eyes on his actual head don't have irises, alongside the eye sockets on his human flesh not having any eyes at all. The former representing him being blinded by rage, the latter his inability to look within. A fantastic quote that I think summarizes Aizen very well is one from Vagabond, that being, in order to hide itself, fear calls out to hatred. Aizen's design over the entire Arrancar saga slowly showcases him losing less and less clothing, literally being stripped of layers to hide behind. His monster form doesn't have any semblance of clothing. It's not concrete, but often Lucifer is depicted as naked during his banishment from heaven. Aizen's hatred of the Soul Society and the world as a whole was born from a fear of being alone forever. His desire to ascend to heaven's throne was partly because he wished for an equal, someone who could challenge him and see things from his perspective. In order to hide itself, this fear buried itself under layers and layers of hatred, until Aizen is shown at his barest, most intimate form. You probably also noticed the 6 heads attached to Aizen's form, his monster form being similar to Hollow's. Hollows in Hueco are based on the Preta realm, a realm who Aizen promised the citizens of salvation from it, but instead replaced it with another version of cyclical suffering. These heads serve as consumption without purpose, very hollow-like. They also resemble the Asauchi, blank slates where one imprints the essence of their soul onto. Eyes being the window of the soul, the Asauchi have mouths for eyes. Imprinting on an Asauchi isn't merely a one-way process, it's also an act of consumption. This can be linked to another representation of these heads, one of the main forms of combat Aizen uses, that being speech. His very mouth is a weapon, and yet that weapon is a connection into his own vanity. He consumes the ideologies and reasons for fighting through conversation with the Gote 13, the essence of their inner selves and why they fight, consuming their Zanpakutos in a sense. He's a demonized Asauchi, consuming his enemy's innermost self, and yet it's ultimately fruitless, as it only further cements how hollow he himself is. And the price of Aizen's pride, arrogance, and inability to accept what's within ends in utter humiliation. All of this antagonization completely bounces back off Ichigo, who doesn't engage with it. The perfect metaphor for this fight, Aizen is essentially talking to himself, with Ichigo's Mugetsu bringing him back down to earth as his arm starts up and falls down. His need to understand why Kisuke does what he does is also a mirroring of past events, questioning Aizen as to why he's doing something so incomprehensible to others. How on earth can a man of his brilliance stand by whilst a world, society, and countless lives are founded on a lie? Aizen's proclamations of victors and how a world should be is referencing Aizen's goal of removing the current order and changing it. However, a double meaning it could refer to is Aizen's way of thinking that he would be alone forever. He believed that's how the world is, and wanting to reject and change that via forming a heart with someone, which in turn does happen. Ichigo understands Aizen. For the first time, he was able to feel his sword, his loneliness, his yearning for someone to see things from his perspective. Aizen has formed a heart with someone. The only person in the series who actually understood Aizen is also the only person who wasn't under the influence of Kyoka Suigetsu. Ichigo doesn't have lofty goals like a lot of protagonists, quite the opposite. He's a humble man only seeking to protect those he cares for, constantly surrounded by loved ones. Aizen is completely alone and had the loftiest dream of them all. It's no surprise that the most prominent espada, being Okiura, perfectly reflects Aizen's own outcome, a desperate need to prove that their respective way of life is right, which ultimately ends in them forming a heart. Now we find ourselves in the 1,000-year Blood War, and the entire crux of how this video came to be. During Aizen's sealing process at the hands of Kisuke, his left eye is blackened and his right is clear. But in the 1,000-year Blood War, his right eye is sealed and his left eye is clear. Judging Kubo's method of storytelling, there's characterization hidden somewhere in his eyes, and to get the answer, we have to flash forward to further in the 1,000-year Blood War, with Mimihagi and Pernida, the hands of God. Mimihagi, the right hand, is reflective of stagnation and stillness. Pernida, the left, is representative of progress and evolution, showcased in the factions they're part of. Mimihagi is with the Soul Society, a society that has been stagnant for thousands of years. Pernida is with the Quincy's, who are attempting to enact change and progression onto the world. The imagery of left and right hand paths is incredibly common within religions. For Bleach's own universe, right is stagnation, left is progression. Taking this symbolism to Aizen's eyes, His left eye is tainted by power, reflective of how Aizen's views on progression are corrupted. His right eye is clear, he sees the truth of the world clearly, being one of the few to know the truth of the Soul King. In the Thousand-Year Blood War, his right is sealed and left is clear. Aizen can now only see progression, change, and evolution in a clear manner. He's no longer the same man. Reflected in the people who seek to free him from Muken, the first is Yuha, seeking to free Aizen and have him work alongside the Vandenreich to achieve their mutual goal. The second is Kyoraku Shunsui, who seeks to free Aizen to have his help in defeating Yuha. Putting into perspective the dynamic of these two characters in relation to Aizen to showcase his growth. With Shunsui and Aizen, Shunsui is a reflection of Aizen's current inner self. When Head Captain Yamamoto dies and Shunsui takes his place, he subsequently loses his right eye during the first invasion. Yamamoto was quite a stagnant leader. Nothing really changed whilst he was in charge, until Ichigo turned up. Now that he's gone, Shunsui looks towards progression. He takes actions that Yamamoto never would have, such as seeking out Ichigo's friends, but more importantly, freeing Aizen. Progression is all he can see. The Soul Society also grows a monumental amount under his rule. Both have their right eye closed off. They only seek the progression of the Soul Society. Yuha seeks its decimation. Yuha and Aizen's dynamic is hefty, to say the least. I'd highly recommend checking out this video if you haven't, but for the purpose of this video, Yuha is everything Aizen wishes to be. A common belief in the fandom is that Yuha is a knockoff Aizen, when in my opinion it's the other way around. Where Aizen is constantly spouting about his divinity and superiority, Yuha has no need. He's completely secure and confident in his status in the world, but more importantly, he actually is a god. Born a god, raised a god, and lived a god. Where Aizen needs to constantly manipulate events in order for things to turn out his way, Yuha simply needs to exist and everything falls into his hands. Aizen needs to go out of his way and use the Hogyoku to create an army to challenge the Soul Society. Yuha simply lives and an army will amass itself before him. Yuha is even able to admit that there are beings above him, that there are things in existence that do not belong to him. Whereas someone like pre-timeskip Aizen would believe that everything is already his. This separation between the two perfectly sets the stage for them to oppose one another. Progression versus stagnation. Yuha's goals are painted as evolution, however they stem from stagnation. A fear of death and reverting the world to a place without it would only, well, regress it, rather than evolve it. Their respective dynamic is also highlighted in the chapter titles during the zenith of their roles as an antagonist. For Aizen we have The End and Transcendent God Rock, however they're encased in brackets. Phrases or sentences that are put in brackets still hold weight and emphasis, but they aren't as impactful as a sentence without them. I like to think of them as Kuba's way of mocking Aizen. Yuha's chapter titles are bracketless, pure, unadulterated divinity. Though the topic of Yuha and his own relationship with humanity and divinity is complex and subjective enough, it deserves a video on its own. With aspects like Aizen still living in the framework of the Soul Society by challenging it with an equal number, 13 versus 13, his statements of being above it all don't hold weight. Yuha amasses 26 to invade the Soul Society, subsequently taking the same method of invasion, seizing control of Hueco before turning their eyes on the Soul Society. Is this a subtextual dick measuring contest between Aizen and Yuha? Or is Yuha just naturally superior? That's up to interpretation, but where Aizen is a man playing God, Yuha is factually divine. The short conversation between Aizen and Yuha before the final fight reflects Aizen's subtle progression. Stop projecting your own anguish onto me. You are the one who is defeated by Ichigo Kurosaki. Usually, Aizen completely dominates his opponents when engaging in a conversation with them, but for one of the very few times in his life, Aizen doesn't refute this. There is no quippy remark, no argument over the technicalities. The only thing we get from Aizen is a single panel of his left eye. Progression, evolution, change, before swiftly changing the subject. Throughout the entire final battle, Yuha antagonizes Aizen, pointing out the contradictions in his actions like protecting quote-unquote Renji, solidarity when faced with a common enemy being the behavior of losers he despises so much. Once again, Aizen doesn't refute these remarks. Each of the three members of the final battle against Yuha are representations of courage. Uryu and Ichigo are similar in the aspect of using courage to change thousand-year-old regimes for the better. What Ichigo means to Aizen is reflected in Aizen becoming Ichigo via Kyoka Suigetsu, the only person who ever managed to reach Aizen's heart. Had this been Deicide Aizen facing off against Yuha, it would be a never-ending bout of arguments between the two. One of the greatest things about this to me is that Aizen seemingly not having full control over Kyoka Suigetsu means a possible reading of the line "So I appear to you as Ichigo Kurosaki" is that Aizen and Ichigo act so similarly that Yuha can't tell the two apart. These two men who were once so opposite, the polar ends of the spectrum when it came to the self and aspect of evolution, that the man who holds all knowledge in his eyes can't tell the difference between the two. Aizen, the man who is previously berating Ichigo and spouting about his superiority, enraged at the possibility that Ichigo could stand above him, said good job to Ichigo. Aizen told Ichigo good job. This Aizen and this Aizen are not the same person. He's far from the egotistical man he once was, no matter how hard he tries to play it off. Once Yuha is defeated, we get Aizen's monologue on courage, the man who was previously so consumed by fear giving the story's ending speech on its core messaging rather than the main character. For the first time in Aizen's life, he's able to experience real, natural growth and change. Unfortunate that he's unable to exercise it, showcased in the panel of Yuha punching a hole through Aizen. His right arm is untouched, his left has been cut off. He's able to see progress, but has no hand in enacting it himself. What crueler punishment for Aizen than realizing your sins and not having the chance to redeem yourself on them? Aizen's entire journey with fraudulence is what makes this speech as impactful as it is. The fact that it's Aizen stating these words. I spoke earlier about Aizen not refuting Yuha, that he usually dominates his opponent during conversation. This is Aizen's refutes, in solitude, where nobody but Aizen himself can hear these words, rather than some public proclamation to the masses about how Yuha was wrong. This is Aizen's most significant monologue, because it's Aizen speaking to himself by himself. Humanity in Bleach is that being imperfect and having room to grow will always outshine perfection but stagnant. Chapter title 306, Not Perfect is Good, in which Mayuri defeats Sael. The word good has three capitalized letters, retranslating to not perfect is God. The heart formed between the bonds between people, the ability to walk forward whilst fending off fear, courage. He was previously a coping loser, a child lashing out at the world. If you only look at his character in the lens he desires you to, you're removing the part that makes Aizen Aizen. He isn't a flawless master manipulator that has everything and everyone under his spell. He's just another person like anyone else, someone with a deep scar of solitude who went down the wrong path. Thank you to anyone who stayed for this whole thing. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.